look at the ancestors. So there's something called the Ancestor Syndrome. So when you line up by birth order number, and miscarriages, abortions, they matter and they count. And so it can change the birth order number of us. And so we look to the ancestors of who we line up with or who we're named for. And then we bring all of this to the table. And it's like we're Sherlock Holmes looking for the puzzle pieces, and we put all of this together. And oftentimes when you do that, then cancers can heal. And you know, at the minimum, this understanding allows the people to have a different way of being in the world, having tools, having ways to navigate stress and to walk through it in a healthier way.
Now, how do, if our parents are no longer living, how do we know what went on 18 months before conception or a year before conception?
Because when the way that we look at the timeline, a person's timeline, the 18 months before you leave to become independent, including food, shelter, and clothing, this is symbolic of the 18 months before you're born. So if you had a really, like, this is a good time and everything's sort of peaceful, then it was probably a peaceful time for mom and dad. But if it's tumultuous, like mine was very tumultuous, but it was very tumultuous for mom and probably grandma, who gave my mom up for adoption. And then the first year of life, or the first year outside of the home, is symbolic of the first year of life. And so when we look across, you find these patterns that continue to go, and then understanding that that's really related to what our parents went through, then it gives us some freedom, because now we have choice. And awareness, we say 80% is just about awareness. So 80% is just bringing that into our awareness. And then 20% is what we do with that awareness. And then that can transform things and give us more insight.
Okay, very good. Now, we know that with all illnesses or diseases, there's that emotional component. But with breast cancer, we know that there's definitely emotional components, you know, especially with the whole mothering, nurturing relationship aspect. So what has been your experience in seeing some root causes, emotional root causes with women with breast cancer?
So with breast cancer, it's the nest conflict. So what's going on in our house? So if people feel separated, if they have been separated, divorces, and especially ugly divorces, you know, when people that have gotten their children taken away, or, you know, kidnapped, you know, that's a huge thing. And so all of this can manifest. Even if a person has, like, for instance, I gave a workshop this past weekend, and there was a breast cancer patient there, and she talked about how she had this beautiful little dog who was her dog, and it was so sweet, and it got hit by a car. And then the dog seemed to be okay, but it was bleeding internally. So then she felt so like, oh my gosh, it's my fault, all this guilt. So guilt and shame and devaluation, separation. The key word for breast cancer is inconceivable. So we ask a question to make a list. What are all the things that have been inconceivable in your life? And then intraductal breast cancer would be about separation, whereas the lobular gland kind of breast cancer would be more about a drama in the nest. So we had one woman that had, there was a big fight with her family on Thanksgiving. Her dad was, you know, yelling at her mom. Her mom has a psychotic break. It was crazy. Right shortly thereafter, she had a breast cancer, or diagnosed with a breast cancer. I mean, there's just so many stories like this that, you know, and it's really what we like to say is that it's the stress of the daily life. Sometimes there's really big stresses, and oftentimes it's ongoing stresses that really build up, and we secretly suffer for them. we keep putting them down because we got to keep a stiff upper lip, and we better never say, what's really going on in your life,
Right.
And so,
Everything's fine, right?
yeah, everything is fine. I'm fine.
Right.
Kind of fine, right? And
Right.
you brush it, and people brush it under the carpet to keep going. And that works for a time, but it doesn't serve us well, because our body, when we don't give it issue, it will go into our tissues.
Oh, very good. Now, explain a little bit more about inconceivable. What are you relating to when it comes to breast cancer? You said that's the word for breast cancer.
So it could be inconceivable to watch your child suffer so much. It could be inconceivable for a person. It's really in the person's mind what is inconceivable, but some thoughts like a husband that cheats on his wife. It's inconceivable that would ever happen, and or abuse to the spouse, and this lack of consideration and love, that could happen. I had a client that she was robbed. She had a lobular breast cancer, and she was robbed, and she was held at gunpoint. That's inconceivable. And that's a big thing, but then I do work with a lot of people from Europe, and right home, and they're separated from their husbands and their sons in Ukraine because they have to stay because they're between 16 and 60 years old. That's inconceivable. Right. And so that's the kind of flavor that that we see many, many times. But anything, it's about perception too. So when a person perceives it to be the worst possible thing or inconceivable, then that also can play a role.
So somebody comes to you and they say, okay, I've been diagnosed with breast cancer. What's the process that you take them through, and how long typically are sessions, like individual sessions, and you work with people for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years? Like, how does the program work?
So generally I tell people to plan 3 to 6 sessions. If they can do a workshop, it's like having a few sessions, and it really pulls it all together. I really love the workshop atmosphere, because what one person says, that will spark the memories of other people. And so it sort of pulls it all together. But individual sessions, in the first session, I do a timeline. So I get the person to think and say, oh, look what happened. I have them fill out paperwork that has a list of traumas and how they felt about it. Because we all know that sometimes we'll talk with somebody and they'll tell you the same story over and over and over again, without really dropping in. And so I'll say, but how does that make you feel? Because it's in the felt experience, the story that we create, who were the participants, how did you feel? Were there any beliefs that were created? So all of those things we sort of uncover and dissect. And then we do a family tree, and, to see, who do you line up with? Who are you named for? What did they experience in their life? And how is that playing a role in your life? And then with the other sessions, I really literally just have them check in with me. What's going on in your daily life? And because when we live in this experience, we don't see it for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We need somebody to help us through that and say, well, what about this? Or how did that make you feel? And, and some people really, it is the stress. I have one woman right now who actually is one of your people. And she's been married for over 50 years. Her husband was a Vietnam survivor, and yet has PTSD, doesn't treat her very well. And, she stayed with them. They don't have any kids, but she stayed with them. So it's inconceivable. Like, she wanted to go for treatment. And he's like, sorry, you're going to have to do that on your own. That's inconceivable. Mm-hmm. That is like, you're my husband, dude. I've been here with you all of these years, and now you're not going to back me up. Mm-hmm. So those kinds of stories, they manifest, especially when we can't find peace about them.
Mm-hmm. Now, so the difference between, well, maybe you can explain German new medicine and recall healing, because I know, people are interested in German new medicine, and I know you're familiar with it.
Yes, I trained extensively in German New Medicine. German New Medicine is the science behind what we do. So Dr. Hammer created this science, based on him losing his son and having a testicular cancer, and then going back to the drawing board. And when CAT scans first started coming out, started noticing if you had this kind of cancer and somebody else did, that there was a spot in the brain. It looked like a little bullseye, and depending on how big and what the circumstances were. So everybody that had a breast cancer, they would find this in a certain specific place, or if it was, the lobular, then it would be found in the cerebellum. So it was really fascinating, and it works this way for every disease, every illness. The law of two phases that were like a rocket, psyche, automatic brain and body, that it downloads into our brain according to how we feel onto the body, and it starts a specific program. And then Dr. Sabah was a student of Dr. Hammer, and he was Jewish and a psychologist, and he would go into the homes and the people in the south of France, and he recognized, when you go into the doctor's office and somebody has like serious thing, and you'll ask, oh, how you doing? Oh, I'm fine, but when you go into the home, you see a different story. And so he understood that. And he said that illness was like an iceberg, and that 10% of why we had an issue was in the tip of the iceberg, but beneath the waterline were these life experiences, and then project purpose, and then the Ancestor Syndrome. And he used the work of Dr. Mark Frichet and Anselin Schutzenberger that really helped him to have a deeper understanding about it. Whereas Dr. Hammer only looked with 6 months to a year beforehand, because he knew that 6 months to a year ago his son had died, and that he ate well, he slept, he did everything he was supposed to do according to Western world, and then he ended up with a testicular cancer. So it takes the science, and then it adds to it with these other assets, and it's amazing to see that it really does play a role. I've seen these generational patterns of people, all you see whole life